Hi, it's Lee from coloringqueen.net, and today I'm colouring this gorgeous picture from the new colouring book by Christine Karron called Wondrous Folk. Now, you can see the links in the description box below the video to see a review of that book if you're interested in these gorgeous pictures. I had so much trouble deciding what picture to colour in this book because they're all gorgeous. But I ended up deciding on this one because I love a cupcake. So today I thought I'd use my Neocolor II water-based crayons on this picture and then add a bit of shading with pencil later. Now, although I've used random open stock Neocolor II that I have before on backgrounds and large elements, I haven't actually used the actual set that I bought years ago now. And you can see that some of the crayons have a white bloom-like substance on them. I guess from being stored for so long without use. And to be honest, I'm a bit scared of using them. So I've decided to overcome the fear and use them on this book. And I actually haven't even swatched them. So it's going to be a bit of a mystery color-wise using them. And I will swatch them soon, I think, because it's quite difficult for me to choose a color without it. So my plan is to use what I think will look okay, just based on their look in the tin. And with the Neocolor II, you can use them straight on the page, or you can scribble a bit out on a plastic sheet, or the one that Caran D'Ache make and pick up the product that way. Or you can just pick a little bit of the crayon with a wet paintbrush if you want. You can blend the colours together just like any other watercolour and make new colours or dilute the pigment to make like a wash. So I've got some clean water here to rinse my brush out when I change colours, a little bit of paper towel to wipe off any excess water. And the more water that you use, obviously, the more of a washy look that you'll get, and which is less pigmented and less saturated. Now, I do tend to go more cautious because it's always so much easier to fix mistakes if there's not a lot of color there, but I expect that I am going to make quite a few mistakes, but hopefully I can fix them up anyway. So I think when I get used to them a little bit more, I'll be more happy to, use a bit more color, but at the moment, I think I'll just stay cautious. So that's it for the Neocolor II. But thinking about cupcakes and this gorgeous picture of the girl with the gorgeous cupcake had me, of course, thinking about cakes in general. Now, I'm a big fan of anything sweet, and I'm a big fan of cupcakes, and they're actually something I make quite a bit. Now, I like that you can have so many different flavors and I think anything, if it's a smaller portion size, it's automatically cute as a button, like a slider or canapes if we're talking savory. But, cupcakes, cake pops, they're all cute as a little button for me. Biscuits, or as my friends across the pond call them, cookies, they're not something I really bake a lot of, though I have plans to. For Christmas, I'll sometimes make some gingerbread men, but it's very humid here and they tend to go a bit saggy if you don't eat them quickly. Luckily, I'm happy to eat them quickly. But I've never really been a biscuit baker. And to inspire me, I've actually joined a fancy Facebook biscuit group that make the most amazing biscuits and cookies for wedding tables. Apparently, that's a thing. You don't have dessert, you have a whole cookie table or something like that. But anyway, I've seen some amazing things there, and hopefully that will get me in the mood for some biscuit baking. So, what's the difference, though, between a biscuit or a cookie and a cake? Now, the baker in me tells me that it's all about the proportion of ingredients and the additional wet ingredients, like a thicker batter towards a thinner batter, that you would have in a cake. And most biscuits, when they're cooked, they're harder, they're crisper, they're flat, whereas a cake is generally larger and hopefully it's moist and not crisp all over. because something's gone wrong with your oven if it has. But to me, I never would have thought that the question of whether something is a biscuit or a cake would be of any importance. Like they're both delicious, and I love gobbling them up. So the difference to me is just always about taste and my consumption of them. But there are people that have found the question of whether something is a biscuit or a cake so important that they've actually gone to court to decide. So the item in question is a product called a Jaffa cake. Now, if you live in the UK, these are a British staple that were introduced by McVitie biscuits in 1927. They are one of the biggest selling products in the UK. And when I lived in the UK, I indulged in quite a few of these, but I considered them a biscuit, not a cake. They were introduced as a round format with 3 layers, the bottom being a very thin Genovese sponge cake that's topped with a dab of orange flavoured jam, and then a chocolate coating covers the top. And I'll pop a picture of one here so that you can see what it looks like if you're not familiar. Now, if you're in Australia and this description is making your mouth water, you can buy them here from the international aisle in most supermarkets. Now, they were named Jaffa cakes after Jaffa oranges, which highlights the orange flavoured jam that features in them. Now, McVitie's probably never realised how popular these products would become because, strangely to me, they never trademarked this name. So you'll often see other bakers produce these products under the same name of Jaffa cakes, but McVitie's is said to be the original. And I do love a nice McVitie's chocolate-coated digestive biscuit too, which fortunately are easy available in Australia from the normal biscuit aisle. But I digress because I'm getting hungry. Now, most things that make it to a court are usually about money. It's not always, but a lot of the time it's about money. And something that always involves a lot of litigation or fighting it out in court is any sort of taxation law. Obviously, people are always looking to reduce their tax liability, and analysing and interpreting tax legislation can often lead to a favourable result if you are willing to take it on. From my personal point of view, just even being able to carry the taxation law in Australia is enough to sort of kill your arms and whatnot. But I digress. For biscuits and cakes, it was certainly worth it for McVitie's to launch some litigation. You see, in 1973 in the UK, a value added tax, or VAT, was introduced in the UK. Now, VAT is a type of consumption tax, which is placed on a product whenever value is added at a stage of production and at a final sale, payable on most goods and services. Now, like all laws, there are a number of exceptions to this. Under the VAT legislation, there is even reduced rates of 5% payable rather than the current rate of 20% in certain circumstances. So, to ensure that the VAT is fair and reasonable, there are also a lot of exemptions or things that are free of the tax. Now, this is usually most food, but within that category, there are some luxury items taxed at a higher rate. So, things like alcohol, confectionery, chocolates, and biscuits covered in chocolate, either whole or in part. Now, one of the things that is free of VAT tax is cake. Now, you're probably seeing where this is going already. From 1973 onwards, when VAT was introduced, McVitie's Jaffa cakes were exempt from VAT as they were classified as cake. I mean, the name is Jaffa cakes, so therefore they're a cake, right? Well, things went well for a time until the minions at British Customs and Excise, the guys that looked after tax, took another look at the best-selling Jaffa cakes. Now, they figured that just because it says it's a cake, in the brand name doesn't actually mean it's a cake. To them, it looked like a biscuit. Now, this is really based on that well-worn phrase that most lawyers will often spout out, which is, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. So it just basically refers to the fact that you can name anything whatever you want, but if the effect is something different, then that's what it is, regardless of what you've called it. So in 1991, the British Customs and Excise decided that Jaffa cakes should be considered biscuits and not cake because, it looks like a biscuit just because you call it a cake. If they were classed as biscuits and being covered in chocolate, they were subject to the VAT tax, which back in 1991 was 17.5%, which is pretty high. As I understand it, in the UK, this means that the manufacturer would pay the tax on the biscuit production, the retailer on the purchase, and the consumer when they purchase the item. So a significant amount on what was one of the most popular treats in the UK at the time. Now, McVitie's, who produced Jaffa Cakes, decided that they would challenge this decision of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. And the question that the court had to decide was whether the product should be classified as a cake or a biscuit, and if it was a biscuit, then it was subject to VAT. The Revenue and Customs argued that just because the name says cake in the title doesn't mean it's a cake. It's that whole duck thing I was talking about before again. They said that it was usually sold in the same aisle as other biscuits. The shape and size of the product was biscuit-shaped, and it was consumed and marketed more like a biscuit than a cake. And as well, the products are eaten with your hands, just like a biscuit, unlike a cake, which you might use a fork or a spoon to eat it with. McVitie's took a more technical approach to their argument. Their argument was that the product was definitely a cake because cake and biscuits go stale in different ways. When a biscuit goes stale, it softens, whereas a cake goes stale and it hardens. Now, this little experiment was actually reproduced in court for everyone, and I don't know whether they shared the soggy biscuits and stale cake after, but who knows. McVitie's even went so far as to bake a cake-sized version of the Jaffa cakes, which was actually 12 inches, so that the court could see that if the product was actually larger, it would definitely look like a cake and harden as a cake does. The judge decided that the name Jaffa cake didn't really matter much. What counted were the ingredients. The sponge part of Jaffa cake is made just like a traditional sponge cake, eggs, flour, sugar, all mixed and aerated. So ingredients-wise, it's a cake. Next, the texture. The judge said cakes are usually soft and crumbly, not crisp or snappable, and Jaffa cakes have that soft, spongy texture, even though the chocolate on top is a bit brittle. Now, size and packaging. The Jaffa cakes are small, more like biscuits, and they're sold in packets. Definitely not how you'd buy a regular cake. Plus, in supermarkets, you'll find them with the biscuits, not the cake. But here's the key point. When Jaffa cakes go stale, they get hard, just like cakes do. Biscuits, on the other hand, go soft when they're old. That's a big clue. The judge also noted that Jaffa cakes are eaten as snacks, usually with your fingers, and they're popular with kids, again, more like biscuits. But the sponge base isn't just a thin layer for the jam and the chocolate. It's a big part of the whole experience of the product, especially in terms of texture. So after weighing it all up, the judge said Jaffa cakes have some biscuit-like qualities, but they have enough cake-like features to be legally considered cakes. And the judge also decided that they're definitely not biscuits, although they do have some of those qualities. In the end, the appeal was allowed, and Jaffa cakes are officially cakes. So for McVitie's and anyone else that's producing Jaffa cakes, it's a win. No VAT is payable because cake is exempt from VAT. So for a best-selling product, it was definitely worth the trip to court. I'm curious though, do you think they're biscuits or cakes? Let me know. It's not the only time that a question of whether something is a biscuit or a cake has come up. Either And there's one more that's even more unusual, but I'll come back to that one at the end. One of the longest running cases in the UK to decide the question of biscuit or cake is the Marks and Spencer tea cake case. For those outside of the UK, Marks and Spencer is a large general type store that sells clothes and homewares, food, and all sorts, similar to Myer or David Jones in Australia. Now, they also sell a product called a chocolate covered tea cake. For those not familiar with this product, it's a biscuit like item with a round bottom disc, a big dollop of marshmallow, and it's covered in chocolate. In Australia, the Arnott's Royal biscuits are similar, and I'll pop a picture here if you're not familiar with the Marks and Spencer tea cake. So back in 1973, when VAT was first introduced in the UK, the tax authorities decided that Marks and Spencer's chocolate-covered tea cakes were actually biscuits, not cakes. And as they were biscuits covered in chocolate, they were taxed. So for over 20 years, Marks and Sparks paid VAT on every tea cake they sold. Fast forward to 1994, and the government suddenly changed its mind. Tea cakes are cakes after all, so no VAT to be paid by Marks and Spencer. Now, understandably, they'd been paying tax for 20 years. They wanted their money back. Now, we're talking about £3.5 million in overpaid tax. So lots of cup of coffees and biscuits or cakes to have with that. But the government never likes to hand things back, and the Revenue Office agreed to only refund 10% on the basis that 90% of the VAT would have been paid by Marks and Spencer customers, not actually Marks and Spencer themselves. The people actually purchasing the tea cakes would have paid the VAT. Now, the revenue view was that if they refunded the whole of the 100% to Marks and Spencer, it would be a windfall to Marks and Spencer of 90%, which in law we call that an unjust enrichment, but we can just think of it as a windfall, if you like. Now, there was a lot of money at issue, and Marks and Spencer dug their heels in, and they decided that they would fight it out. Now, I doubt very much that they would have anticipated how long this fight would take. They argued that under UK and European law, they were entitled to a full refund, and the case bounced between the UK courts and the European Court of Justice for over a decade, for 13 years in fact. That's a lot of tea cakes. Now, finally, the European Court eventually ruled in Marks and Spencer's favour, saying it was unfair to treat them differently from their competitors, and that the principles of equal treatment and fiscal neutrality had been breached. And the House of Lords agreed, and Marks and Spencer finally got their full refund. So after 13 years, Marks and Spencer had a sweet victory, if you like. And the case set a big precedent for how overpaid VAT should be refunded in the UK. Now, here's one that I alluded to before. It's one that'll make you smile a bit when we think about what's a cake. It's an extreme example, in my opinion, of what is a cake under UK VAT law, but here we go. Pringles, you might know them. They're the chips or crisps in a can. They also had a crack at the whole is it a cake or a biscuit argument. Now, of course, it's another VAT question because the amount of money at issue is huge when you consider how many of these products are consumed. For those not familiar, Pringles are a product that produces a uniform, crisp potato-like product that's contained in a long tubular can that could be resealed. Each of the stacked potato products in the can seems to be of a uniform shape, and in fact they're only made with 42% of potato flour, and the rest of the product is made from a mix of other flours, wheat starch, and vegetable oil. Now, originally, when Pringles came out, they were marketed as potato chips, but that fell foul of other potato chip manufacturers who argued that they were basically made from a dough rather than a fried potato, and they shouldn't be classified as a potato chip. Now, Pringles are created by actually mixing all those flours together and starches, and they actually form a dough that's rolled out very thin, and then it's stamped into oval shapes, fried and seasoned. Unlike potato chips that are cut from a potato, sliced and fried and seasoned. Pringles argued that because they were made from a dough, that they were actually more like a cake than a chip, and therefore they weren't subject to VAT. The VAT and Duties Tribunal, of course, argued that they were chips because one of the major ingredients was potato flour. It went to the High Court, who agreed that they were not potato chips due to the process on how they were made. It was, the judge ruled, more like a cake or a bread, which as a general foodstuff is 0 rated. Now, before Pringles could get overly excited and jump up and down and have a party, the Revenue Office decided that they would go to the Court of Appeal on this question, who decided in a completely different way. They decided that they would remove the culinary arguments from this on how it was made and the process, and tried a simpler approach. The case centered basically on the potato-ness of the snack, as the content of Pringles is 42% potato flour, and Lord Justice Jacob said that that's more than enough potato content for it to be a reasonable view that Pringles are made from potato. And one of the things that they did was ask, if a child was given the product, what would a child class the product as? And they decided it would be a chip or a crisp. That meant that the product was not a cake, and Procter & Gamble, who were the owners of the Pringles brand at the time, had to pay millions in taxes. So now we know that Pringles aren't a cake, and well, tea cakes are a cake and Jaffa cakes are a cake. Don't let me get started on what's a biscuit and what's not. So I hope some of those stories have put a bit of a smile on your face, or at least made you look forward to having a delicious chocolate-coated treat at some stage, and considering the VAT or the tax that you might have to pay on that luxury item, and have a piece of cake instead that's free of tax. So I'm curious how many people would have thought that the products that I mentioned, Jaffa cakes and the Marks and Spencer tea cakes, were biscuits or cakes. And by the way, my apologies to my UK friends if I have messed up any part of your fascinating VAT system. We also have a consumption tax in Australia, which is called GST, or the Goods and Services Tax. But in my opinion, it is so much easier than your system. Anyway, I really should have swatched out these Neocolors first, because now that I have completed this picture, I can see that the skin tone is way more yellow than I would have liked. But we'll just pretend that that's sunshine rather than that she looks like she's got jaundice. And on reflection, I could have put down way more pigment with the Neocolors. But like all things, it's a learning curve, and I was a bit cautious about putting too much down in case I couldn't take it off. Now, by the way, the Tombow Mono eraser, the sand eraser, will take off intense. So if you rub it gently, so I would imagine it would also easily take off Neocolor if you never need to erase some. And if I had time over, I would put more colour down on the skin and for the larger areas that I have here. But, lesson learned. I've added some Prismacolor pencils off screen for some shading and for some smaller details as well. And I did try and reduce the yellowness on her skin with a bit of pink and light peach, but it wasn't really effective. Best off to start with the colours, I guess, that you want the final look to be in the first place. All in all, I'm happy with the first attempt. I knew there would be mistakes, but next time I will be swatching those colours out first. And that's it from me. Until next time, stay safe and happy colouring.